fair line of warmth, like the suggestion of what the full length of Izzy's body might feel like pressed up against his own. Pay attention, Bonnet. He swallowed and nodded, throat suddenly dry, and almost missed the moment that Izzy moved forward. He swung his prosthetic leg over Stede's thigh, using his grip on the back of Stede's chair as an ankle point to lower himself down. The motion was smooth enough to remind Stede suddenly that the muscles hidden beneath Izzy's shirt were free.
Bel C is back on the Our Flag Means Fanfiction podcast with another narrated fic for your listening pleasure. This time, the vibes are Steddy Hands. In this post-season 2 fic, Izzy convalesces from the bullet wound, and Ed blames Stede for Izzy getting shot and gives him the silent treatment. Stede then comes up with a plan to bring harmony back to the inn. This is Dual Temptation by Sunspeckfreckle, read by Bel C, who, I might add, is very new to the fandom and is already making podfics and literally traveling the world to see Reese's shows. So give Bel C a hand. The comments on this fic are plentiful and enthusiastic. One reads, "The consequences of the finale are so good here. It's sweet and tender and hot, and I really loved this." And if you'd like to send in anything for the podcast, definitely do that. Just find a fic you like, get the author's permission, record it, then email the audio file to ourflagmeansfanfiction@gmail.com. Without further ado, here is Dual Temptation, read by Bel C.
Still not talking to you, Izzy Bonnet? Stede jumped a little, not having heard Izzy's approach. It really was astounding how quietly the man could get around, especially now with his prosthetic. He wondered whether it might be useful to dig up the bell collar Ed had been made to wear on his probation, so at least they'd be able to hear the little bugger coming. It would suit him in a way, Stede supposed. Much as Izzy was sometimes referred to as Blackbeard's dog, the man did have some remarkably cat-like tendencies. That silent, stealthy approach for one, the hissing and spitting and insulting everyone in his vicinity for another, although that had merged into an aloof sort of indifference post-Kraken era, seeking comfort at a distance. He was remarkably adept at getting underfoot, too, which couldn't be made worse if you had a bell on him. Stede realized he'd been so absorbed by imagining putting a collar on Izzy that he hadn't actually answered the question. He sniffed, jutting his chin out. "No, he's not, as it turns out," he said defiantly, as if daring Izzy to blame him for Ed's lack of communication. Izzy shrugged, leaning his weight into his good leg. "Well, your shit-fucking plan did just about get me killed," he said. "You didn't actually die," Stede pointed out. "And I'll remind you that you got stabbed me at one point, in about the same spot you got shot, no less. So that really just makes us even, I think." Izzy shrugged again. Eddie doesn't like other people breaking his things. Stede decided not to examine the fire that stoked in his belly at the casual declaration of Ed's possession of Izzy. "You get better, though," he managed to say. Izzy hummed noncommittedly. "And yet, he's still not talking to you. Funny that." Stede could feel himself start to pout, and forcibly try to stop himself. From the amused look on Izzy's face, it didn't seem like he was particularly successful. "What am I meant to do, then?" He did his best not to whine, but didn't think he was particularly successful there either. "I've already apologized to him and to you. Honestly, if you of all people aren't holding a grudge, I really don't see why he's hanging on to this." Izzy shrugged a third time. It was starting to get a little irritating. "I think I'm just trying to keep the peace for his sake. That I haven't actually forgiven you." "Haven't you?" Izzy smiled with a few too many teeth. "Water under the bridge, Bonnet," he said, saccharine sweet, and Stede couldn't quite tell if it was genuine or sarcasm, or some additional layer of verbal subterfuge designed to throw Stede off balance. In any case, it was working. Stede decided to operate as if things were working out in his favor. After all, they often did. What would you suggest to make him see that, then? The man loves being in love, Bonnet, he said, entirely throwing Stede for a loop. Might have taken me too long to recognize that, for it to do any good for myself, but I've seen how he is with you, when he's not pissed off with you. Even when he is, honestly. Stede frowned. Are you saying I just need to wait? I wouldn't have expected such a passive suggestion from you, Izzy. I had something more active in mind, Izzy replied. His gaze dropped deliberately to Stede's lips, then back up again. Could do something to prove I'm not holding a grudge against you. He raised an eyebrow. Would only need to pretend for a bit. For a moment, Stede wondered if he was grossly misinterpreting Izzy's suggestion, or maybe that Izzy had decided his sense of humor should take a bizarre turn. But no, he'd stated it in all seriousness, as if it was a simple practicality. The most expedient way to get Ed's attention would be if Stede and Izzy... what? Kissed? Plumbed the depths? Well, he could certainly see something like that getting its attention. And Izzy was a pirate, after all. It wasn't entirely uncommon for men like him to act more freely with that sort of thing. Hell, Stede had seen plenty of that amongst the crew of the Revenge. It just... the thought of Izzy only suggesting it as a peacekeeping tactic made something small and disappointed sit low in his stomach. But still... But you said Edward didn't like other people touching his things, he breathed, instead of any sort of normal response he could have offered. Breaking them, Izzy corrected, gaze dipping again to Stede's mouth. Doesn't one imply the other? Stede pressed. Because of Izzy was offering, Stede found it impossible to actually balk at the idea. If nothing else, the sheer curiosity was too great for him to deny. Izzy gave him another of those two wide grins, predatory, like he wanted to sink his teeth into Stede until he broke skin. Think I can manage a bit of rough handling. Stede licked his lips, unable to help himself, even knowing Izzy was still looking directly at them. Won't it seem a little left field, he said, not sure why his voice was shaking a little. Given our history. Izzy cocked his head to the side a little, eyelids hooded, as he gave Stede a once-over. Not really, he replied. Looking at our more recent history, as you say, we've been spending some time together, you and me. I've been hard at work trying to make you a halfway decent pirate. Some pretty hands-on lessons in there, working intimately together. Things often have a way of getting heated like that. Stede swallowed. I'm not a pirate anymore, he pointed out feebly. A small smile quirked Izzy's lips. Aspiring innkeeper, my mistake, he said. Wouldn't happen to be counting the days till the Revenge is due back to visit, would you? Stede opened and closed his mouth, said the non-sequitur, without any words issuing between. Izzy's smirk grew. Yeah, you're not suited to life on land, Bonnet, he said. None of us are. You know the only reason you even got me off the ship in the first place was because I was unconscious. You'd been shot in the gut, Izzy, Stede told him, tension giving way to a well-worn argument. You needed someplace low-key and quiet to rest. You were hardly going to get that on board a pirate ship. Ed insisted on nursing you back to health, and I was hardly about to let him do that alone, in case... He faltered. In case the damage or the infection actually did me in, and he tried to off himself again. Stede's lips tightened, remembering the hollow, dazzled look in Ed's eyes as Izzy had lain in his sickbed, breath rattling in his chest. The way Ed had clutched so desperately at Izzy's clammy fingers, how Stede had done the same whenever Ed's exhaustion gave way to fitful sleep. Izzy had been so weak for so long, even after the fever had broken, He'd really only recovered at all by the skin of his teeth. Stede couldn't imagine that the confined dam quarters and constant pitching roll of the ship would have allowed him to pull through. Not to mention, Izzy seemed the type of sailor that preferred to die at sea rather than whilst bedbound on land. There was every chance he'd only survived out of spite. I just wanted to prove to him that I wasn't going to run off without him again, Stede said, evading the question. Now you're worried that he thinks you regret leaving the ship, Izzy replied, because obviously Izzy wasn't about to let him get off that easily. Ed wanted this, Stede protested weakly, deflecting. Izzy's expression did not change. Edward wants a lot of things, he replied. Doesn't always mean he's going to think them through properly, what the consequences are. He cocked his head again, and Stede realized abruptly how close he'd gotten. He's a brilliant man, we both know that. Once the shithole is in decent enough condition that it can actually be run as an inn, you know he's going to be fucking miserable, catering to the whims of guests. He wasn't built to be subservient. It would drive him insane. Stede focused on frowning so that his gaze wouldn't inexplicably linger on the upward curve of Izzy's lips. But he must have realized that already. Imagine so, yeah. But he's stubborn, you know that. Stede felt his heart sink a little. You think he won't go if I suggested that we left with the crew once they come back? Can't say I've got the best record of being able to guess what he'll do for the past little while, but he's still giving you the silent treatment by the time they get here. Izzy pulled a face. Don't know that his head would be in the right place to leave. And part of the reason he hasn't forgiven me is because he thinks you haven't really, so Stede nodded slowly to himself. We show him that you have. Could remind him what he's missing out on, Izzy agreed. He moved closer. Stede seated ground and abruptly found his back making contact with a wall. Me or you? Stede asked stupidly. Izzy gave him another lopsided smile. Why don't you tell me? One of Izzy's hands rose, fingers spreading across Stede's chest. Stede tried to tell himself that his breath only hitched because he missed Ed touching him like this, that the heat bleeding from beneath Izzy's palm was only making him flush because it was unfamiliar. Without breaking eye contact, Izzy murmured, Dinner's here. Stede's brow furrowed, then followed Izzy's shifting line of sight to Ed, standing in the doorway, a frown on his face, and 3 fat, silvery fish hanging from a brace in his hand. Good chat, Bonnet, Izzy said, patting Stede's chest, before thunking his way over to Edward, relieving him of his catch to get busy with preparing dinner. Whilst Ed had definitely gotten more adept at catching fish than he had been at the start, he still didn't like the way the scales would stick to his fingers during the scaling. Stede nicked himself badly enough whenever he tried that Izzy, grumbling, had stepped in before Stede could accidentally stab himself through the palm. Ed allowed himself to be unburdened, but he was still frowning, eyes moving from Izzy's hands to Stede's chest, like he could see some invisible thread still connecting them there. His own hands seemed too empty now in comparison, and Stede found himself aching to have Ed place his hands where Izzy's had just been, to soak up the last of the residual heat from Izzy's palm and let it mix with his own. He felt himself flush deeper. Nice catch today, he offered, nodding in the direction that Izzy had carried off the fish. That what they're calling it these days, Ed replied, coolly, and Stede's face heated further. That's not I meant the fish, he stammered, discombobulated enough still by the whole situation, and the fact that it was the longest sentence Ed had said to him since before Izzy had woken from his fever, that he suddenly found himself struggling to construct a sentence himself. Ed hummed, non-committal. The look in his eyes was intense. Not quite open, but not hostile either, and it made Stede hot under the collar regardless. What are you calling that with Izzy, then? That's new, Stede blurted. Then he wondered whether Izzy had been implying that they should pretend it had been going on for some time. that their hands-on pirating lessons had ended up more handsy than they had been in reality. The thought made him flush again, imagining how that might have played out had things gone that way. He could clearly picture Izzy, sword knocked from his hand, sweat glistening on his skin, looking up at Stede with begrudging approval after Stede had bested him in a training bout. He imagined having driven Izzy down onto his back, straddling his hips to use his own body weight to keep Izzy down. Both of them breathing heavy, their faces already mere inches apart. At that point, it really wouldn't be that great a distance to close, mouths meeting in a clash. He pulled himself out of the fantasy before he could let it go any further. "We haven't done much," he finished weakly. Ed kept giving him that intense look, then eventually gave another of those hums. "Gonna see if Viz needs a hand with the veggies," he said, and without further ado slipped off towards the kitchen. Stede watched him go for a moment, then abruptly came to the realization that maybe pulling a fuckery ostensibly designed to make Ed jealous wasn't the smartest plan, given Ed's historical reactions to Izzy doing things related to Stede that Ed didn't like. He dashed into the kitchen after Ed, whilst also doing his best not to look like he was chasing after him in a panic. But, as it turned out, he had just been catastrophizing a little. Ed wasn't doing anything more than being a bit of a nuisance as Izzy cooked. Between that and Stede still somewhat anxiously lurking close behind, it didn't take long for Izzy to start grumbling about them hovering and telling them both to fuck off until dinner was ready. Suitably chastened, off they both fucked, Ed muttering something about attending to some outdoor carpentry whilst there was still some sunlight left in the evening, and Stede made himself useful tidying up inside until Izzy declared the food ready. Dinner was a quiet, somewhat awkward affair. Ed was still being a little intense, and so was Izzy, honestly. Stede should have seen it coming, what with the way Izzy had poked fun at both him and Ed when they had first gotten back together. He was just as much of an incorrigible tease when he was the one doing the actual flirting, as it turned out. Stede nearly jumped out of his skin at one point when he felt Izzy's boot graze gently up the inside of one of his ankles, and when Stede glared at him, Izzy just quietly grinned into his meal. The rest of the week was filled with unexpected little touches like that. Izzy was surprisingly tactile given how uptight he'd shown himself to be otherwise. It felt increasingly familiar to have Izzy in his personal space. So much so that Stede kept forgetting that it was only meant to be pretend. He kept catching himself just as he was about to lean in for a kiss, too easily falling into the casual romantic affection that he'd only shared with Ed for a relatively brief time. And Ed was starting to thaw towards him again, slowly. The conversations they did have were stilted and intense, but that was progress in and of itself. Still, Izzy and Stede hadn't had much of a conversation about what they were doing beyond the initial planning, and Stede felt a little awkward bringing it up now. He certainly wouldn't have been able to say anything about it without blushing horribly and probably making an absolute fool of himself. Certainly not without accidentally revealing that he hadn't been able to stop spinning the fantasies where it was real. Selfish imaginings where this all ended with both Izzy and Ed falling into bed with him. This had all been Izzy's idea, so it was really better that Stede let him choose how far any of this went, he decided. If it were left up to Stede, he'd probably just end up overeager, too enthusiastic, let himself go further than Izzy had intended or wanted. Stede didn't know that he'd ever be able to live down the shame of forcing Izzy to shove him off and tell him to not get ahead of himself. It just made more sense to let Izzy take charge on that front, Stede decided. Unfortunately, the not talking to Izzy about this part of things meant that Izzy didn't exactly get the memo. "You're meant to be instigating, Bonnet," Izzy told him as they both cleared away the lunch dishes several days later. Stede blinked. "I am?" Hadn't the whole point of this been for Izzy to demonstrate how much he tolerated Stede now? In fairness, though, Izzy actually did tolerate him quite well. He had to have even suggested this course of action to begin with. Izzy rolled his eyes. What, do you need a demonstration? Stede knew he was mostly being sarcastic, but that'd be really helpful, actually. Izzy looked at him askance for a moment, then reached out and dragged over one of the mismatched dining chairs. Sit, he said, and Stede promptly sat. Like this, Izzy was the one towering over him, for once. His hand hadn't left the back of the chair, and it meant that his wrist was now resting on Stede's shoulder, a bare line of warmth, like the suggestion of what the full length of Izzy's body might feel like pressed up against his own. Pay attention, Bonnet. He swallowed and nodded, throat suddenly dry, and almost missed the moment that Izzy moved forward. He swung his prosthetic leg over Stede's thigh, using his grip on the back of Stede's chair as an ankle point to lower himself down. The motion was smooth enough to remind Stede, suddenly, that the muscles hidden beneath Izzy's shirt were really rather well defined, and surely that extended to Izzy's legs. Or, well, leg. Either way, he now found himself, still a little unexpectedly, with a lapful of the former first mate of the Revenge. Stede blinked up at him, the heat from Izzy's thighs against his own almost making him feel like his skin had caught a light. I've just realized this is the second time I've been in this situation, Stede blurted, because his brain had apparently decided it didn't need to be too involved in the process. That right, Izzy murmured, settling securely onto his lap. Stede's hands didn't have anywhere logical to go other than Izzy's thighs, the warm, solid weight of them flexing beneath his palms. Stede raked his eyes over the silvered curls peeking out from the collar of Izzy's shirt. He couldn't help but notice the way it fell open far more than usual, the cravat and ring normally knotted in place at the base of Izzy's throat entirely absent. I think I prefer this view, though, he said, already forgetting that that wasn't what this was about, that this was a farce. Izzy laughed, though, a throaty chuckle that Stede struggled to not instantly be obsessed with. Just planning on looking, were you? Izzy teased, a lazy grin touching at his lips. Well, you did offer a demonstration, Stede prompted, hopeful, and felt the now familiar firebrand heat of Izzy's hand sliding up his chest. This time, though, it traveled further, slipping up past his collarbone, up the column of his throat, until warm fingers were cradling his jaw, tipping his head back even as Izzy leant in close. Lips a hair's breadth from Stede's. Oh, this is new. Stede's head jolted in direction of Ed's voice, narrowly avoiding headbutting Izzy in the nose. He expected his hands to flinch away from Izzy's thighs, but if anything, they locked on tighter. Dimpling flesh beneath the cotton trousers Izzy wore around the to-be-in these days in favor of his leathers. Izzy let both forearms rest against Stede's collarbones, body twisted slightly to look back at Ed, chest partially pressed up against Stede's. Edward, he said evenly. Surprised you're going along with whatever this is, Ed replied, matching his tone. Izzy raised an eyebrow. Who said he was the one that started it? His gaze was a challenge as he shrugged one shoulder with unaffected casualness. You weren't using him, so... Ed stalked a little closer. So you decided to take him for a ride instead? He finished. Something like that, yeah. He got you shot, Ed said, the dangerous edge to his tone offset by the bulge beginning to form in his trousers. Izzy snorted. You actually shot me, he said. Forgiven you, haven't I? And that was really the crux of the matter, wasn't it? It wasn't so much that Ed had reservations about Stede deserving Izzy's forgiveness for how his rash decisions had led to Izzy being shot. It was much more about the far more active choices Ed had made, ones that had left their permanent marks on Izzy, both visible and not. Planning on doing something useful about it? Izzy asked, something wary in his voice. I'm running out of toes, Edward. Ed's gaze dropped to Izzy's prosthetic, then flicked back up again. Izzy was still twisted around in Stede's lap, chin tilted up, jaw set in challenge. He moved closer, cataloging Stede's grip on his thighs, the way Izzy's arms were draped about Stede's shoulders, trailing his own fingers gently up the side of Izzy's throat. The swallow tattoo there fluttered its wings under his touch as Izzy swallowed, thighs shifting atop Stede's. It was almost like he was shocked that Edward was touching him tenderly at all, rather than simply tipping Izzy out of Stede's lap and taking his place. "Think I might have interrupted," Ed murmured. "Reckon you and Steve were about to kiss before I came in? Should probably let you get back to that." Ed towered over them both, eyes dark with promise, hands curling over Izzy's shoulders as Izzy's breath hitched. There was something hungry in his gaze, preparing to feast on the sight of Izzy and Stede kissing with ardor, with passion, with something real. "Wait!" Stede blurted, flushing when two sets of eyes swung towards him. He swallowed, ducking his head a little and fixing his gaze at the hollow of Izzy's throat. I can't do this, I'm sorry." Izzy went very still in his lap, hemmed in with Ed up against his back. "Edward, Stede said, his throat sticking, voice shaking slightly. He couldn't lift his gaze to meet Ed's either. "I've been lying to you. Izzy and I haven't been. It's just pretend. You weren't talking to me because my plan to escape the Navy nearly got Izzy killed, and I thought if I could show you that he'd forgiven me, then you might forgive me too, but Stede trailed off, realizing his hands were still resting on Izzy's thighs. It felt too unbearably intimate all of a sudden, but flinching away now would feel so much worse. Instead, he sat, paralyzed, salt burning at the corner of his eyes, as he kept them leveled at Izzy's collarbones. "I don't want to do this. What if it's just pretend?" Izzy didn't move, but between his only having one functioning knee and the fact that Ed hadn't moved from behind him either, Stede couldn't exactly blame him for not immediately extricating himself. What if... Izzy's voice was uncertain, raspier than usual, carrying in it a vulnerability Stede hadn't seen him show since the Calypso's elevations. Stede found himself as enamored by the display as he had been back then, his heartbeat picking up hopefully. What if it wasn't pretend? Stede's eyes went wide, flying up to meet Izzy's, the earlier resistance vanishing. For all his confidence in suggesting this plan to begin with, Stede could see his own uncertainties reflected in Izzy's eyes, but hope, too, tentative and fragile. I think I'd like that, Stede whispered. "I think I like that, too," Ed added. "Been enough pretending about our feelings between the three of us, I reckon. If I've got to work on it, you two do as well." Stede let out a huff of laughter. "Fair enough," he acquiesced. "Izzy? If I say yes, can we get on with it?" he grumbled. "I think I'd like that," Stede repeated warmly, letting one hand rise from Izzy's thighs to cup his cheek. Before Stede could even get that far, though, Izzy was already descending on him, fists gathering in his collar and pulling their faces together, finally kissing him. It wasn't elegant. It was downright messy, in fact, and actually quite terrible. Too many teeth, too much pressure. Then Izzy let up a little, tilting his head to better slot his mouth against Stede's. Then it was perfection. Their lips glided against one another so smoothly that it seemed a significant oversight that Stede hadn't been kissing Izzy this whole time. Stede's hand diverted from Izzy's cheek, sliding into the open neckline of his shirt. When the collar proved an impediment in getting at what lay beneath, Stede's hand slid up and down, slipping below the hem of his shirt before pushing upwards. He felt another set of fingers brushing his own and felt Izzy shiver beneath his palms as Ed helped ease Izzy's shirt up over his head. tossed carelessly onto the kitchen floor. Izzy's hips rolled forward, pressing up against Stede's rapidly growing erection. Stede moaned at the pressure, breath picking up at the way Ed's eyes darkened over Izzy's shoulder. Ed's hands hadn't left Izzy's chest, and now they roamed, tracing along the silver-dark trail of hair running upwards from his navel, the twin scars cradling his pecs, before settling on thumbing at the barbells pierced through his nipples. Izzy panted, open-mouthed, and just generally looked so kissable that Stede couldn't really be held responsible for diving in to do just that. The soft moans that Stede swallowed from Izzy's mouth were delicate things, coaxed forth by the ministration of Ed's hands, the way he'd leant down to press kisses of his own along the edges of the whip scars that curled up the top of Izzy's back. Izzy's mouth soon fell away from Stede's, but only in favor of pressing kisses along Stede's jaw and down his throat, not quite breaking skin as he ground down against Stede's lap again. It wasn't long before Ed's hands roamed lower, fingers tangling with Stede's where they returned to Izzy's thighs, then lower still, tentative as he traced the outside of the top strap of Izzy's prosthesis. "This okay?" Ed asked softly, and Izzy let out a snort. "Never asked before. Why the fuck would you start now?" Ed's lips tightened, hands stilling. "Maybe I want to do better, Izzy." "Maybe you just want to get in my trousers again now that you know Bonnet's in with a shot himself," Izzy replied. "Maybe it's both," Ed countered, hands still moving. "Izzy," Stede said quietly, cradling his face again, "you don't have to agree to this unless you want to." Izzy, a little predictably, gave him something close to a sneer, only softened by the fact that he still had his bare arms flung about Stede's shoulders. "Fuck off, Bonnet." "Oh, would you like me to?" Stede asked, a little belligerent, because turnabout was fair play. "Only you're the one sitting in my lap." His jaw clenched, the vulnerability behind his combativeness obvious. "Both of you talk too much," he grumbled. Ed seemed to realize that that was as close to a direct answer as he was going to get from Izzy, and returned to the straps holding the prosthetic in place. Stede could read the eagerness simmering beneath his expression, but his hands were steady, methodical, as they undid the straps one by one. Ed was wholly focused on the task at hand, a small furrow between his brow, but Stede found himself fixated by the look on Izzy's face, trepidatious and turned on. He studiously didn't meet Stede's gaze until he did, and then it was like he was caught in orbit, a stray moon encircling two suns. Ed's movements were slow and careful as he eased the prosthetic from what remained of Izzy's left leg, gently setting it aside, foot returning, running his hands over Izzy's thighs. Izzy rocked forward towards Ed's hands, seemingly trying to coax them towards the crux of his hips. Ed took the hint, hands shifting higher to the waist of Izzy's trousers. "All right, Iz?" Ed asked quietly, apparently unable to keep from seeking reassurance. Izzy growled, seizing Ed's wrist and shoving it beneath the waistband. Stede and Ed both sucked in a shocked breath, and a moment later Izzy followed, body jolting as Ed's hands started to shift rhythmically beneath the fabric. Stede couldn't help but capture the small sounds falling from Izzy's lips with his own, kissing slow and languid as Ed's hands worked between them. Ed was close enough that his knuckles occasionally brushed up against Stede's cock through the layers of fabric separating them, making Stede shudder with want, and it didn't take long for that want to drive him to distraction. "I want to see," he gasped into his mouth, fingers fumbling for the laces of Izzy's trousers, moaning at the feel of Ed's fingers still working beneath them. Izzy, still panting and lending his weight into Stede, lifted his hips, giving Ed and Stede enough space to ease his trousers down. They were careful in slipping the pant leg over the knot of scar tissue at the end of Izzy's left thigh, but once it was over, they let the other side simply fall, pulling around his boot. Ed's hand had remained cupped around Izzy's cunt the entire time, 2 fingers pressed inside. Now it was properly on display, Ed's fingers sticky as they slid back and spread Izzy's lips wide, cock hard and jutting between the frame of Ed's fingers. Stede made a needy sound at the sight and quickly wriggled out of his own trousers, hissing slightly at the brush of air over his now exposed cock. Izzy's eyebrows rose, and Ed chuckled behind him. Oh, right. Should have warned you, Iz. A thread of anxiety wound its way through Stede's arousal. It won't be too much, will it? Izzy glowered at him. You saying you think I can't handle it, Bonnet? Stede flushed, a little mortified by the way Izzy's derisive tone made his cock twitch. I'm not saying that. I just know it's a bit unwieldy. Stede made a choked-off sound as Izzy sneered at him, spat into his palm, then wrapped his hand round Stede's cock. His touch was hot and slick, movements in time with the plunge of Ed's fingers into Izzy's core. Stede hadn't had much occasion to focus on the size of Izzy's hands, but now, even rough and calloused as they were, they seemed delicate, fingertips not quite touching as they encircled Stede's cock, working him to full hardness with embarrassing speed. His eye met Ed's over Izzy's shoulder, letting out a cracked moan at the smoldering heat there, then flicked back up to Izzy, able to see the grin ringing the hazel of his eyes this close. Izzy shifted even closer, or tried to, the movement somewhat clumsy with one limb out of commission. Let me, Iz, Ed murmured, withdrawing his fingers from Izzy's cunt. He wrapped his fingers around Stede's cock instead, still slick with Izzy's juices, and held Stede steady as his other hand steered Izzy's hips forward. Stede couldn't help but whimper at the sight of Ed guiding Izzy onto his cock, and Izzy didn't fare much better, a flush rising to his cheeks and spilling down his chest, soft wine falling from his lips as his head lolled back against Ed's shoulder. Stede was aware of the mechanics of this, of course. He'd fathered 2 children, after all, but despite having much the same anatomy that Mary did, the feel of Izzy's sinking onto his cock was a world apart, and his hands twitched against Izzy's thighs as he fought not to pull him down faster. He consoled himself by leaning up for a kiss, which Izzy met hungrily, groaning into Stede's mouth as he tugged at his bottom lip with his teeth. Stede gripped at his thighs, able to feel how obscenely spread they were against his own, and moaned again as he pictured what Ed must be saying. Ed, Izzy gasped against Stede's tongue, his mind clearly traveling along a similar path. There's a tub of coconut oil in the kitchen. The sound of footfalls echoed between Stede and Izzy's ragged breaths, Izzy huffing into Stede's mouth as he started to clumsily rock back and forth in Stede's lap. The uncoordinated movement was the opposite of a turn-up for Stede, letting out another groan as he let his mouth drop to Izzy's throat, one hand shifting to Izzy's lower back to keep him steady. Ed returned moments later, inhaling sharply at the sight that greeted him. Edward, Izzy groaned, his eyes, which had slipped shut against the onslaught of Stede's kisses, cracked back open, hazy with lust. Want you? Right here, Ed promised, wrestling his own trousers down his thighs before moving back to where he'd been. He'd unscrewed the lid of the tub of oil, the contents already partially melted in the warm air, and scooped out a generous amount onto his fingers. He gave himself a few languid strokes, leaving a slick trail of oil behind, then focused his attention on Izzy, drawing his oil fingers down between Izzy's cheeks. Stede could feel the moment that Ed's fingers slipped inside Izzy from the way he shuddered in Stede's lap, sinking down hard onto his cock before lifting up with a jerky motion. His groan vibrated against Stede's lips, still pressed to his throat, and he clenched down on Ed's fingers and Stede's cock alike. Stede fucked up into him with a sudden jolt, the legs of the chair skittering slightly beneath him. Ed pressed in further, adding another finger, enough for Stede to feel the steady pulse of him stretching Izzy's hole out through the thin barrier of flesh separating Ed from his cock. Oh, Izzy, you feel exquisite, I can feel. Oh, I want to feel. I got it, Ed murmured, fingers pulling free, wiping clean before taking hold of his redly oiled cock. Stede shifted eagerly, pulling Izzy further onto his lap and inching his own hips down, tilting Izzy's ass up to better enable Ed's access. Izzy made a desperate sound at the manhandling, then a longer, deeper sound as Ed's cock fucked along the shallow valley of his ass, once, twice, then caught on his rim and began to press in. He clutched at Stede's shoulders, nails digging in as his head tipped back against Ed's chest again.
Oh,
Stede whimpered, both at the small pinpricks of pain and the fact that he could feel the press of Ed's cock through Izzy's body. He could feel as he pulled out halfway, only to push back in again. Oh, Edward. Izzy and Stede moaned in unison, then both let out breathless laughs as Ed began to build their rhythm. By all rights, the position should have been too awkward to work. The chair creaked ominously under the strain of it, but it held, the back of it gripped tight by Ed and Izzy's interlocked fingers. Izzy did his best to rock back and forth between the two men buried inside him, but most of the movement really came from Ed, with lesser contributions from Stede. Both of them remained mindful of not moving too enthusiastically, lest they make the chair give up on them after all. They both kissed at his throat in tandem, only breaking away to kiss each other instead, as he left sandwiched tightly between them as they locked lips over his shoulder. The slight squeeze only seemed to rile Izzy further, his breath ragged and fast as he writhed between them in what little space he had left. All three of them were rapidly soaked with sweat, the shirts Ed and Stede were still wearing clinging to their own bodies as well as Izzy's. It didn't take long for their shirts to join Izzy's in a pile on the floor, the sweat of their bodies quickly mingling and matting Izzy's abundance of body hair to his skin. It made the barbell pierce through his nipples glint all the more, and when Ed pulled Izzy back against his own body, Stede took the opportunity to let his head dip down, sucking one of the barbels into his mouth, biting down on the skin surrounding it only somewhat gently. Izzy shouted, hawking, and Ed reached down to where Stede was pressed into Izzy's body, gathering some of the slick there before letting his fingers shift a little higher. He stroked along Izzy's cock as both he and Stede plunged deep into Izzy's holes, Izzy's moans rapidly growing in pitch and volume before he went silent entirely. His body went taut as a bowstring as he spasmed around them both, gush of heat making the sound of Stede fucking up into him just a little bit louder. Oh, fuck, Stede whimpered and lost all sense of rhythm, rapidly following Izzy over the edge and spilling into him. Hold him steady for me, Ed told him, voice strained, and Stede instantly obeyed, arms looping over Izzy's shoulders to keep him impaled on Stede's still hard cock, both of them riding out the aftershocks as Ed fucked into him harder. Izzy's face was tucked into the crook of Stede's neck, but he whined and shifted, then sank his teeth into the juncture of Stede's shoulder to muffle the sound. Stede's cock gave a valiant twitch, still buried deep and starting to grow a little tender with overstimulation. Before it could tip over into actual pain, Ed's pace picked up further, then went completely erratic before he pressed himself in as far as his body would allow. Izzy let out another groan, vibrating into Stede's shoulder through his teeth, then delicately unlatched them, just as Ed slumped against his back. The chair creaked a little louder, but all three of them ignored it, instead taking the time to get their heaving chests under control. Was this your plan all along, Izzy? Stede asked, breathless and a little curious. Izzy snorted. You think I can wrangle either of you that well? Dunno, Ed murmured from behind him, mischievous. Reckon you handled both of us fine just now. Fucking incorrigible, the pair of you, Izzy grumbled, but his tone betrayed fondness. Speak for yourself, mate. You had to have some idea. Stede felt Izzy smile against his collarbone. Might have had a bit of an inkling, yeah. Stede grinned as well, delighting in the way the corners of Ed's eyes crinkled. And here was me thinking that concocting a fuckery was more of my and Ed's area. Fuck off, Bonnet, Izzy said. No, Stede replied, still smiling at them both. I don't think I will.
That was Dual Temptation by Sunspeckfreckle, read by Bel C. Head to the show notes to give the author a comment and a kudos. And if you're enjoying the Our Flag Means Fanfiction podcast, please give us a rating and a review. It helps the show get out there, and it helps show the world that there's still an audience for Our Flag related content. Also, more podfics are available to listen to in the Podfic database, which is linked in the show notes. Until next time, do creations, be cringe, commit crime. Bye!